value listening to music quite a bit. He values not being driven crazy, so you should come to somewhere in between. Now, if he has the right, if you have the right to make as much noise as you want, right? Then what he can do is he can pay you to shut off your music, to turn it down. He says, look, okay, I understand you have the right to do it, but I'll pay you to reduce the amount of music. On the other hand, if you have an absolute right to quiet and he can't listen to anything unless you give him permission, then it makes sense for him to pay you for all the noise that he makes, right? And either way, you're going to reach the efficient outcome, which is you should have some amount of noise, but not a lot, right? So why do you need the government to come in and impose a tax for the noise? Basically, even when it's not clear who has the absolute right to the noise or not, you almost always have some sort of de facto property right. So basically, there's some norm that you have about how much noise is a reasonable amount, and if you want to get past that, you make some agreement with the person. Somebody pays somebody else, and you reach the efficient arrangement. So shouldn't all problems of externalities just solve themselves this way? Anytime anyone's causing a problem for someone else, they can always get together and someone can make some payment to the other person. So this argument is called Stigler's Coase theorem. It's also sometimes called Coase's theorem and the Coase theorem, but I like to call it Stigler's Coase theorem because Coase basically didn't believe this, but Stigler attributed it to him. And so sort of the most correct name is probably Stigler's Coase theorem. So, and it says that if people can costlessly get together and bargain with one another to figure out the efficient outcome, then we always get efficiency, regardless of the initial allocation of property rights, as long as they're defined. And as long as income effects are small, that is, the efficient level doesn't depend too much on who has the right, then the outcome is independent of the assignment of property rights. So the problem is, what do we mean by it's easy for us to get together and make an agreement with one another? Basically, all that's meant by that is anything that gets in the way of us making an efficient agreement with one another. So another way to put this thing is that it's just saying that if we can efficiently agree with one another, then efficiency arises, right? So it's just a tautology, basically. Another way of stating it would be to say, all is for the best in the best of all possible worlds, right? So if the world is perfect, then everything will turn out okay. Nonetheless, the idea that bargaining may help us get to efficiency can be useful in some cases. So for example, bargaining usually works well when there's a very small number of information that's relevant. And when the two people can find one another very easily, like you and your roommate. And this is the reason why mergers sometimes can be used to facilitate efficient arrangements. So, for example, a condominium association owns all of the condominium. That's what a condo is. Owns actually all the condos. And you don't actually own your condo. You just own a share in the condominium association. And the reason that they do that is because that gets everyone to try to take into account all the effects they're having on other people. Similarly, like when a company owns a company town, they have a stake in everything that goes on there. And that leads them to internalize a lot of the externalities that are caused. Similarly, cooperative firms, by being owned by the consumers that they have externalities on, they take into account their interests. And the European Union, though it's not clear whether it's doing this so well, the idea was that all of them would be setting their policies to take into account the externalities they had on other people. Greece doesn't seem to have realized that. But mergers don't obviously always work, because as we talked about in lecture 2, there are still conflicts even within companies, right? Just because two things are part of the same company doesn't mean that some people don't do some things to hurt other people within the company. And as we talked about earlier today, it's it's not clear that people don't do things that harm themselves. So even combining everything into one person doesn't necessarily solve the problem, right? If the externality is not a real externality, it's just a pecuniary externality, actually the merger can make things worse. So this is particularly true when there's one group that can easily merge with each other, and another group, like consumers, that can't. So like competing companies exert pecuniary but not real externalities on one another. They might merge together, form a cartel, right, and harm consumers. The consumers find it hard to get together and form a group, and therefore that can lead actually to things being worse than if they didn't combine to deal with those externalities. Industry-wide lobby groups, or things like the American Medical Association, are another example of that. Or more informally, in the sort of things we were talking about, packs of popular girls in high school can sort of band together and exert the sort of market power over in the mate market that drives crazy all the guys in the school, right? So the monopolistic, sometimes the private sector can solve these problems precisely by creating a monopoly. So, for example, when there's a monopoly control over something like faxes, that can actually be helpful to a large extent because they have an interest in seeing the fax machine succeed, because they'll be able to make a profit off of that eventually, right? And so the problem in the United States with the fax machine, why it took so long to get going, is that nobody had sort of responsibility for it. Nobody was interested in subsidizing it in the short term in order to try to get it up to scale so that the market would take off. An example of this is, newspapers are usually very much subsidized or even offered free to consumers to internalize the benefits to the advertisers of people reading the newspaper. And if there wasn't someone who could make a profit off of those advertisers, those newspapers wouldn't be produced and made available because they're costly to print. Now, the monopolists can often be useful in the short run, especially if they realize this could be a great product, it could really create a lot of value, let me subsidize it in the short term in order to create value in the long term. It can help the market get over the hump and get it established. That can be true both in sort of these network externality cases I was talking about, but also in cities. Often cities will make a big investment at a large cost to create an industrial cluster that will create lots of benefits because they'll make it back in tax revenue later. But the problem is that in the long term, the monopoly is always going to charge a higher price than a competitive market would. The competitive market will usually charge a price somewhere around the average price, whereas the average cost, whereas the monopolist is always going to charge a price that allows them to make a profit. And so in the long run, even though the monopoly can be useful to get things going, in the long run, the monopoly is always going to charge too high of a price. Okay, so I think that despite some of the potential benefits of these private solutions, the Coase theorem, the idea that you can always solve these problems privately, is usually misleading. And the reason is that, even if your neighbor and you could bargain over the right solution, you could also have imposed a tax on you making noise, and you still could have bargained to the right solution, right? So there's nothing about the tax that makes anything less efficient. All it's saying is that no matter where you start, you can always bargain to efficiency. And the good thing about the Pigouvian intervention is it means that in case you can't bargain, you can always fall back on the Pigouvian solution. The bigger problem is that many externalities affect a ton of people in a very, very diffuse way. And this makes bargaining very difficult. So imagine if everyone on the planet who was affected by climate change got together in a room and tried to reach a bargain about what the efficient solution would be. That would almost certainly be a total disaster because you just have to talk to too many people. It would take forever. It would be completely impossible, right? And more importantly, the information needed to figure out what's the efficient level of climate change is very diffuse. You know, if I went around and polled everyone in this room or everyone all over the planet about like what's the efficient level of greenhouse gases, they would have like absolutely no idea, right? Because even the scientists who figure out these things do it based on 1,000 different scientific studies and talking to all these different scientists. Each individual person has very little information, so it doesn't work very well to just like get everyone together and have them figure it out, right? So bargaining can only be as good as the information of the people who are involved in the bargaining is. So the real question about a market failure is not, you know, can people bargain to efficiency, but rather who is it that knows best and most clearly what the efficient outcome and solution is. And the Coase theorem, therefore, really doesn't tell us whether an intervention is good or bad. It just reminds us that bargaining may help improve things, but that as much as possible, we have to find the way to get the right information together. So the real problem that faces us is how do we get the right information? And this is really going to be the theme of the next class. Typically, the information is diffused across lots of different people with different expertise. And the problem of designing the right externality policy is how to combine all the different information. And in doing this, there's going to be a lot of trade-offs that are going to be crucial. And the relative importance of different people's information is going to be the key determinant of policy. Simplistic answers like the Coase theorem would just say leave it and everything will sort itself out, really ignore these problems. And hopefully the next class will help guard you against that sort of naive response. So thanks. And I hope you enjoy the next problem.